It's sometime in the early 1st century BCE, and you are standing beneath the sprawling shadow of Rome's Capitoline Hill. The streets are unusually quiet, though you know, at least by official decree, that today is a day of triumph. A general is returning victorious from the provinces, his chariot gleaming, his soldiers powdered and perfumed, his captives unusually well behaved. It is supposed to be a day of drums and shouting, but the only sound you hear is the soft brush of sandaled feet on cobblestones, and perhaps the quiet snoring of a senator dozing under his toga. What happened? Let's back up. The Roman triumph was once the most spectacular event in the city's calendar. Imagine an enormous, slowly moving carnival infused with imperial pride. Victorious generals, triumphatores, parading through the streets, wearing golden laurel crowns and purple togas stitched with lightning motifs. Elephants might stumble through the forum, strange animals carted in from foreign lands, giraffes maybe, or even rhinoceroses. A mock naval battle might be staged, followed by the slow-rolling display of looted treasures. Jars of honey, silk bolts, golden statuary, and confused foreign dignitaries looking somewhat overwhelmed. But this particular triumph, historically attributed to one Lucius Cornelius Scipio, a minor consul who helped suppress a rebellion in a half-forgotten part of Hispania, was not one for the books. And yet, the Senate had granted him a triumph anyway. Why? Because of the politics. There were no real triumphs left. Rome was grinding down, overextended, and frankly, bored of itself. Scipio's campaign had been minor and largely uneventful. According to the military records, which were themselves probably padded for prestige, the entire campaign involved more time building roads than engaging in any actual battle. He had faced a disorganized local militia armed with slings and olive branches. One of their towns had surrendered simply because the Romans promised to rebuild their communal bathhouse. Still, a triumph was a triumph. These were expensive affairs, so naturally, most Romans knew what was coming. The problem was, they'd already seen it all before. And again, and again. The same pomp, the same crowds, the same stony-faced priestesses of Vesta walking in time, with music written centuries ago. So on that day, the day of Scipio's minor triumph, the people of Rome did something remarkable. They collectively, almost silently, decided not to come. Vendors showed up, of course, they always did. But by midday, many had packed up, having sold only a few dates and lukewarm cups of spiced wine. The grand procession made its way past rows of empty balconies and inattentive onlookers. Some children played ball beneath the arches of the Basilica Aemilia. Even the prisoners taken from Hispania looked bored. Scipio's heralds shouted announcements, but their voices echoed without audience. The marching band, a group of conscripted flautists and horn players, trailed off halfway through the triumphal theme. One young horn player was seen sitting down to peel an orange mid-parade. At the height of the route, where cheers and ovations should have thundered through the streets, Scipio raised a hand to accept the people's admiration, and was met with the quiet chirp of sparrows nesting beneath the arches of the Temple of Jupiter. Even the Senate, who had commissioned the spectacle, were less than enthusiastic. Some of them didn't bother to wear the ceremonial robes. One was reported to have nodded off during the ritual sacrifice, and another kept rereading the same scroll on grain imports from Sicily, pretending to be deeply interested. Of course, some formalities still took place. A white bull was sacrificed. The public treasury paid out the expected bonus to Scipio's men. And the general himself delivered a speech. He had practiced it for days, but he delivered it to a courtyard full of pigeons, several distracted scribes, and a single merchant looking for his lost donkey. And then there was the triumphal banquet held in the Field of Mars. Only half the invited guests showed up. The roast boar went cold, the honeyed dates crystallized, and the great jug of Falernian wine, shipped in at great expense from a distant estate, remained mostly untouched. It was, by all accounts, the most boring triumph in Roman history, and perhaps one of the most telling. For you see, the triumph had become a relic. Once a symbol of extraordinary valor and conquest, It had transformed into a bureaucratic formality, a ceremonial yawn. Rome had outgrown its own pageantry, or maybe it had simply tired of it. But this raises a curious question. What happens to a civilization when its most sacred ceremonies begin to feel routine, even sleepy? You may imagine Lucius Cornelius Scipio, dust gently settling on his once shining breastplate, standing on the marble steps of the temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus. The sun is warm. The crowd is, to put it kindly, absent. His guards stand at dutiful attention, though one of them is visibly chewing on a fig. The marble amplifies, every coffin shifting sandal. Still, the consul clears his throat. He is determined to deliver his speech. Scipio's speech is long, very long. He begins with the required invocations to the gods, including a particularly florid stanza praising Mars, which he borrowed from a popular play staged the previous year. Then comes the recounting of his military achievements, a retelling padded with euphemisms, rhetorical pauses, and the occasional philosophical musing on fate and honor. He speaks of tactical advances that were in reality delayed bridge-building efforts, of skirmishes that were more like stern conversations with village elders, of fortifications overcome, which were in fact abandoned goat pens. All the while, his voice echoes across the mostly vacant forum. His audience includes a dozing junior senator, a pair of temple pigeons, 3 food vendors passing a wineskin between them, and an old woman selling laurel wreaths at half price. But here is the deeper truth, one that speaks volumes about the moment Rome was in. Lucius Scipio wasn't particularly ambitious. He didn't hunger for power like Caesar. He didn't plot conquests or upheavals. He was a career man, a diligent follower of procedure, a lifelong committee signer. And perhaps, in this respect, he represented more of the Roman spirit than the conquerors and rebels did. The Republic, after all, ran on bureaucracy, endless rituals, census reports, ledger books, and people like Scipio who knew how to fill them out correctly. His triumph was dull, not because it failed, but because it succeeded precisely according to form. That, paradoxically, was the problem. Triumphs had once been rare, exceptional events reserved for moments when Rome truly staggered the world with its might. They were rewards for awe-inspiring victories, and sometimes years would pass without one being granted. But by the late Republic, the criteria had relaxed. Political favors, strategic bribery, and clever speechwriters had turned the triumph into a more accessible, if less meaningful, achievement. Scipio knew this. He knew his victory was more of a performance than a feat, but he also knew the expectations. Rome demanded that he stand in full armor, sight obscure battle gods, raise his arms toward the heavens, and pretend the parade mattered. So, he did. And when he reached the final flourish of his speech, a grand appeal to Jupiter to bless the eternal city with everlasting fortune, the silence that followed was not due to awe, but from a lack of anyone to clap. A thin, delayed smattering of applause came from a trio of bored scribes in the corner, one of whom promptly yawned into his stylus. Afterward, Scipio returned to his home, an elegant but modest domus in the Subura district. There, he removed his ceremonial laurels, gently folded his toga, and sat down to a supper of lentils and boiled greens. His wife asked how it went. He answered truthfully, "It occurred." But the uneventful nature of the event did not go unnoticed, at least among Rome's more thoughtful chroniclers. A young scholar named Cinna the Minor, no relation to the more famous conspirator, wrote in his personal notes, "It is said, General Scipio marched through the city today, laurel in hand, gods invoked, songs sung. I saw none of it, but I heard the silence, and I felt a curious calm. Rome, I think, has learned to yawn with dignity." There is something gently profound in that observation. Rome, the restless conqueror, the ever-expanding juggernaut, was beginning to see its own reflection in the mirror of ceremony. Like a child who once danced wildly, but now traces the steps with bored familiarity, the empire had entered an age of rituals for their own sake. One might wonder then, What purpose did a triumph serve when no one truly cared to watch? Perhaps it became less about public spectacle and more about state preservation. A society with such a vast bureaucratic machine needed moments like these, not to inspire, but to maintain continuity. The triumph became a reassuring sign that Rome was still Rome, even if the crowds no longer cheered and the elephants no longer surprised. In this way, Scipio played his part flawlessly. He didn't captivate, he didn't dazzle, but he followed the instructions, and this was precisely what was expected. Meanwhile, others in the city had their own interpretations. The augurs declared the underattended triumph a sign of future drought. The merchants claimed the bad turnout was due to poor marketing, and the local playwrights turned it into quiet satire, producing a one-act comedy titled Triumphus Interruptus, which depicted a sleepy general accidentally napping through his own parade. The Senate, of course, recorded the day as a success. The records, preserved in wax and then carefully copied onto papyrus scrolls, noted the proper order and solemnity befitting a Roman triumph. There was no mention of the empty streets, or the discarded garlands, or the dog that trotted behind the procession barking at its own echo. Still, the lingering question remained: if no one believes in the pageantry, does the pageantry still matter? Or does it matter even more because it's the only thing left to believe in? The following morning, as the last garlands wilted and the streets returned to their regular rhythm of shouting vendors, clanging carts, and the occasional goat escape, Rome had all but forgotten Lucius Cornelius Scipio's triumph. The banners were being repurposed as sunshades. The musicians, 2 lyre players and a flutist who had shown up an hour late, were back to performing in the atrium of a middling bathhouse, and Scipio himself, he was reading an invoice for marble tiles. And yet, something curious lingered. Despite the low turnout and the tepid applause, the rituals had been fulfilled. The sacred chickens were consulted, though one fell asleep in its cage. The white ox had been paraded, garlanded, and eventually sacrificed with all due decorum, albeit in front of a mostly uninterested janitor sweeping temple steps. The Pontifex Maximus, though quietly nursing a headache from the previous night's banquet, nodded solemnly at all the right moments. The Sibylline books were not consulted. They hadn't been for weeks. But a priest did mumble a few lines, from memory, which counted for enough. To an outsider, it may have all seemed absurd, but to Rome, absurdity was not disqualifying. In fact, it often meant you were doing something correctly. It's worth remembering that the Roman Republic, and later the Empire, ran on a bewildering network of expectations, not just political or legal, but religious, social, symbolic. To be Roman was to be embedded in a schedule of obligations that went back centuries, many of which had lost any practical function, yet were still observed with something close to reverence. Triumphs, as a concept, belonged to this symbolic order. They were not merely celebrations of conquest, but acts of renewal, like renewing a vow to the city itself. In theory, the general undergoing a triumph was meant to appear godlike, or at least semi-divine. He wore a golden toga embroidered with purple, held a laurel branch, and painted his face red in imitation of Jupiter. But here's a quiet truth the Republic rarely said aloud. The real purpose of the triumph wasn't to glorify the general. It was to remind everyone that even generals were temporary. You see, as the general rode in his chariot, a slave stood behind him whispering, "Memento mori." Remember, you are mortal. This wasn't some grim threat. It was part of the ritual. A way of grounding even the most exalted figure in the reality that he was, in the end, a citizen subject to the law. Even in a half-empty forum, even when the slave whispering was the general's own cousin filling in, the words were still spoken. "Memento mori." Scipio heard them. He nodded faintly. And later that night, as he sat in his modest courtyard, the scent of rosemary drifting from a neighbor's brazier, he found himself feeling oddly satisfied. Not proud exactly, but settled. The ceremony hadn't thrilled, it hadn't transformed him, but it had reminded him and others, perhaps in ways they hadn't fully realized, that Rome still worked, the gears still turned. The rites were observed. The Republic still knew how to conduct itself, even if no one showed up to watch. Elsewhere in the city, a group of young philosophy students at the portico of Octavia debated whether the emptiness of the triumph was itself the purest form of triumph. They quoted Epictetus, then argued about whether the absence of meaning might be its own kind of meaning. One of them fell asleep mid-argument. An old priest of Saturn, who had witnessed no fewer than 20 triumphs in his life, simply shrugged. They never made sense, he muttered to a friend. But neither does life. But there was one person who was deeply moved by the events, though he hadn't seen them in person. His name was Marcus Livius Drusus, a young magistrate in training, and an insomniac of the most incurable kind. That night, unable to sleep, he'd wandered the streets and paused near the Capitoline Hill just as Scipio's procession had passed. No trumpets, no applause, just the sound of sandal against stone and a general waving politely to no one. It stayed with Marcus. In his journal that week, he wrote, "There is comfort in a ritual performed for its own sake. It requires no audience. To be valid, Rome marches not because she is watched, but because she remembers." That line would be copied years later by a minor historian compiling curious observations of public life, and from there would trickle down into the common sayings of Roman schoolboys who found it amusingly deep. Lucius Scipio's triumph was never recorded as a failure. It was simply recorded, and as time passed, it faded, as most triumphs did, into the long parchment scroll of forgotten celebrations. What remained was a kind of whisper, not just of memento mori, but of something gentler. The form still holds, in a time of shifting alliances, swelling wealth gaps, and rumours of populist demagogues on the rise. That mattered. The fact that a man could still ride through Rome in a chariot, mumble the required phrases, and then return home to eat lentils in peace. Well, it was boring, yes, but reassuringly so. And isn't that perhaps the quiet power of ceremony? Not to dazzle, but to remind. Not to command awe, but to provide structure. In a world prone to chaos and clamour, the measured dullness of a triumph that no one watched might be the most comforting thing of all. Even now, if you close your eyes, you might picture the laurel crown resting lightly on Scipio's thinning hair, the creak of the chariot wheels, the silent crowd of statues watching from marble perches, and a man, not extraordinary, not beloved, just Roman, fulfilling a duty older than himself. And so, history does not remember the cheers that did not come, nor the speeches few heard, but it remembers the march itself. The triumph happened, and that was enough. You are on the open steppe. The wind is crisp, unbothered by the idea of time, and your horse's hooves thud against the flattened grass in a rhythm that could almost be mistaken for intention. Somewhere behind you, your home yurt fades into the horizon. Somewhere ahead, another waits, with a fire going, a fresh bowl of air rag, fermented mare's milk, and most importantly, a sealed packet of letters to continue the journey east. It's not the 19th century, it's not even the 13th. It's the early 1200s, and you are a courier of the Mongol yam system, perhaps the fastest, quietest, and most logistically advanced postal network the pre-modern world had ever seen. Before the Pony Express galloped across the American West in the 1860s, lasting a grand total of 18 months before the telegraph politely rendered it obsolete, there was the yam. The name itself simply means checkpoint or relay station, but that modest description belies an enormous and breathtakingly efficient infrastructure. At its height, the Mongol postal system connected Beijing to the Caspian Sea, Siberia to Samarkand, at a pace that would astonish even modern couriers burdened by logistics software and flat tires. How did they manage it? Not with leather bags or jingling spurs, but with yurts, thousands of them. Technically called gurs in Mongolian, these round, collapsible tents were more than homes. They were outposts, inns, kitchens, and information hubs rolled into one felt-wrapped, wood-framed circle. Every 25 to 30 miles along the steppe, the distance a horse could reasonably gallop before needing rest. A jur would be ready to receive riders, resupply them with food and fresh horses, and pass on news, edicts, or intelligence. The genius of the system was its simplicity. The jurs didn't need to be built anew. They were mobile, adaptable, and manned by families who already understood the rhythms of nomadic survival. If a road shifted due to war, weather, or whim, the entire network could shift with it. And this was no dusty trail of obscurity. The Yam operated under the direct authority of the Khagan, the great Khan himself. In fact, Genghis Khan made the creation and perfection of the Yam one of his top administrative priorities, second only to, say, conquering most of Eurasia. From the very beginning, Genghis Khan understood something that few conquerors had before. It was not enough to defeat an enemy. You had to connect the world you just conquered. The Yam was his solution, a way of linking a vast, multilingual, multi-ethnic empire not just by fear or sword, but by information. A message sent from Karakoram could be in Samarkand in under 2 weeks, an astonishing speed for the time. Mongol. Postal riders carried official paisa, engraved metal badges of authority that entitled them to horses, supplies, and housing from anyone within the network. A bronze paisa might get you a warm meal and a slow donkey. A gold one, that got you a fast horse, a flute of kumis, and the chance to skip someone else's dinner line. These weren't just couriers, they were emissaries, agents, sometimes spies, sometimes monks. One Chinese traveler reported that even letters from distant provinces would arrive so swiftly they seemed to have flown. Another Persian historian marveled at the consistency of delivery. Even during snowstorms, sandstorms, or military campaigns, the system somehow kept functioning. Compare this to the American Pony Express, which, while romanticized as a triumph of grit and frontier courage, was never particularly practical. The Express had 190 stations, 400 horses, and operated for just over a year before vanishing into legend and bankruptcy. Riders carried thin satchels and dodged arrows in the Utah desert, but they were always on the edge of exhaustion and profitability. The Yam, by contrast, endured for over a century in full operation and left behind no romantic legends, only logistics. And perhaps that's why we rarely hear about it. The Mongol system lacks the cinematic appeal of gun-toting riders with names like Buffalo Bill. It offers no dusty saloons or telegraph lines humming with Morse code. It offers instead stability, regularity, a night spent sipping broth in a warm tent beside someone else's grandmother. A routine. In the most soothing way imaginable, it was boring. But let's not mistake boring for unremarkable. At its peak under Ogedei Khan and later Kublai Khan, the Yam included over 1,400 relay stations. Some sources suggest that as many as 50,000 horses were maintained across the system to support constant movement. That's not an error. 50,000. Most of them rotated regularly to prevent fatigue. Mongol administrators even kept logs of which horses had been used at which post and when they should be retired. You, as a rider, might switch mounts up to 3 times a day, and this wasn't just for military dispatches. The Yam also carried grain quotas, tax notices, invitations to diplomatic banquets, weather reports, marriage proposals, astrological charts, and detailed population records. One station might forward a packet of Sogdian poetry to the next town. Another might relay a Mongol prince's request for a particular kind of goose feather pillow. Because why shouldn't empires dream comfortably? Even Marco Polo was impressed. He described stations so well stocked that travelers could dine like minor nobles while their horses rested. No less than 200,000 horses were used in the system, he claimed, though Marco was known to inflate numbers in favor of narrative drama. Still, exaggeration or not, the Yam worked quietly, effectively, and without drama. If the military machine of the Mongol Empire was its sword, the Yam was its spinal cord, unseen but essential. And as you, the rider, roll into your next station, you're met not with fanfare, but with soup, soft cushions, and a practiced hand that reaches out for your satchel. You nod. No words need to be spoken. You rest. The message continues without you. But why did the yam eventually fade? And could such a system survive in today's world of digital chaos and algorithmic overwhelm? Let's carry that question forward. The wind on the steppe never really stops. It just changes tone. One morning, it whispers news from Samarkand. The next, it carries the sharp chill of a courier galloping in from the north. The rhythm is steady, but the stories shift like dust trails on a trotting horse. If you're a station keeper in the yam system, this shifting rhythm is your life. Your task is not glory, but predictability. It is, in a word, delightfully bureaucratic. And at the center of this system of steps, felt, and hooves was a surprisingly complex and well-documented paper trail. Genghis Khan had understood early. On that conquest alone couldn't hold an empire. Paperwork could. To manage communication over 7,000 miles, you needed more than riders. You needed a postal culture and a postal policy. First, there was the paisa, the small but powerful badge that transformed any courier into a state official. These metal medallions were inscribed with authority straight from the Great Khan, and they came in several levels, each engraved with the level of service the bearer could demand: bronze, silver, and gold, not just for show, but for logistics. A bronze paisa got you a fresh horse. Silver might get you two. But a gold paisa, that opened every door. It meant a priority place by the hearth, meat from the good part of the sheep, and access to the fast horses reserved for emergencies. Not that the yam played favourites recklessly. The Khans were quite strict about misuse. If someone flashed a paisa for a personal errand, they could lose the badge or worse, be exiled, fined, or in one case, reassigned to manure duty in a distant province. The system worked because it had accountability. Riders logged arrival times. Station keepers recorded the names, messages, and condition of every passing courier. Records were kept not only in Mongolian, but often translated into Persian, Chinese, and Uyghur, depending on the region. All this from a people frequently stereotyped by their enemies as uncivilized. Even more quietly impressive was the yam's menu. Each post wasn't just a rest stop, it was a kind of logistical pantry. Horses were rotated every few days to keep them fresh. Fermented mare's milk, airag, was brewed on site. Dried curds, arul, mutton, and boiled dumplings were stocked as part of the standard fare. The Mongols also had a knack for preserving butter and cheese, storing them in sheep stomach pouches buried just under the surface. Cool, dry, and perfect for long-haul travel. In the colder regions, posts had fire pits and stacks of wood prepared. In the hotter stretches, riders were given soaked felt cloths and wide-brimmed headgear to guard against sunstroke. Some stations even stocked herbal remedies: dried licorice root, juniper bark, and dried berries, all catalogued for use by the station keeper or accompanying monk. And then there were the maps. The Mongol Empire is often pictured as one giant, sprawling chaos, but this is a modern misperception. In fact, they were excellent cartographers. They had to be. The yam system required it. Several Chinese and Persian chroniclers noted that Mongol administrators carried detailed route maps etched onto animal hides or drawn on scrolls of mulberry paper. Roads were annotated with river crossings, grazing lands, seasonal hazards, and even preferred tea-drinking spots. This wasn't a dusty road with a few haphazard inns. It was a conscious web. Kublai Khan expanded it even further. In China, where the Mongols ruled under the Yuan dynasty, he incorporated Confucian administrators into the postal system, established courier schools, and even experimented with something that seems startlingly modern: a primitive postal code system. Each major city and province had a designation. Each station had an identifying number and ledger book. Riders were expected to memorize not just directions, but the tone of various roads. Some were official, others for military-only use. and a few so secret they had to be verbally passed down. In this way, the yam resembled not so much a caravan path, but a living organism, always moving, always responsive, and perhaps most impressive of all, it was free. For officials and state messages at least, the average Mongol didn't have to pay a coin to move a letter, provided they had the proper seal or badge. This stood in stark contrast to the systems in Europe and the Middle East, where sending a letter might cost as much as a month's wages, or worse, be intercepted by the local duke's nosy clerics. But Mongol generosity in communication had a purpose. Free mail wasn't a luxury, it was an empire-wide surveillance and control mechanism. Every message that passed through the yam could be copied or noted. Every courier could be questioned. The entire system allowed the Khans to keep their fingers on the pulse of cities they might never visit. This wasn't merely a mail service, it was an intelligence network. Even foreign visitors used it. Marco Polo, when traveling from Venice to China and back again, relied heavily on the yam. The same with Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan explorer. They marveled not only at the efficiency, but at the politeness, even in remote areas. Riders were offered silk robes, oil for their saddles, and in some cases, musical accompaniment from a local bard if the journey had been particularly long. The yam was not a military tool, though it aided armies. It was not a trade route, though merchants used it. It was, in many ways, a cultural artery through which not just goods and orders, but ideas and languages flowed. Yet no empire lasts forever. By the late 1300s, as Mongol unity frayed and the Silk roads buckled under competing factions, the yam weakened. The costs of maintaining thousands of horses, tons of grain, and a professional postal class became harder to bear as local rulers claimed independence and civil wars brewed. The great yam stations were looted or abandoned. Roads fell into disrepair. The yurts stopped appearing on the horizon. The Ottoman Empire would later imitate the system, as would the Russians, but neither achieved the soft-spoken elegance of the original. The yam, at its peak, had made the world smaller, quietly, without fanfare. And what does it say about a civilization that its greatest invention wasn't a weapon, but a way to say, I have something to tell you? But perhaps we're being too nostalgic. If the yam was so perfect, why did it fail? Was it empire fatigue, the high cost of calm logistics, or was it something deeper, something inevitable in the tension between mobility and control? Let's ride further into the last days of the yam. By the late 14th century, the whisper of hooves across the grasslands had started to fade. The Mongol Empire, once an interconnected sprawl stretching from the Korean peninsula to the edges of Europe, was breaking apart. And with it, the great silent machinery of the yam began to unravel. The yam system was a marvel of soft infrastructure, but it relied on a single brittle truth: imperial unity. Under Genghis Khan and his immediate descendants, the central authority was strong enough to enforce station funding, rider training, and supply quotas across thousands of miles. But after the reign of Kublai Khan, fragmentation began. 4 major khanates, Yuan, China, Ilkhanate, Persia, Chagatai, Central Asia, and the Golden Horde, Russia, began operating more or less independently. At first, the yam limped along in these divided realms. Each khanate maintained its own stations and routes. Riders could still pass from Samarkand to Beijing, albeit with more paperwork and more suspicious glares at each border. But with time, things began to rot. Some station keepers stopped receiving their grain allotments. Horses meant for fresh relays were kept for personal use, or sold. Roads fell into disrepair. Bridges collapsed and were never rebuilt. And without the weight of a unified empire to enforce standards, paisas, those once sacred postal badges, were forged, bought and traded on the black market. Corruption crept in. A silver paisa, once issued only for official business, could now be found in the hands of silk merchants, hoping to shave days off their journeys. Local governors used their stations as private inns, collecting bribes for better horses. Records went missing. routes became dangerous, and still, some kept riding. There's a sparse account from a Persian administrator in the early 1300s who describes meeting a rider near Herat, a grizzled man with cracked boots and a paisa worn smooth. By wind and time, he had delivered a letter from the east, written in a mixture of Chinese and Mongolian script, addressed to an official who had been dead for 2 years. The rider hadn't known. No one had told him. He just followed the route. What had once been a smooth system had become a game of chance. Some stations were still functional, maintained out of loyalty or habit, but others were abandoned, their yurts collapsed and horses gone. The road was no longer a web. It had frayed into isolated threads, and yet curiously, the idea of the yam endured. Even centuries later, long after the Mongols had faded from the world stage, traces of their postal legacy remained. In Russia, for example, the yamschik, a term for a postal coachman, directly descended from the Mongol term. Russian Tsars adopted elements of the yam for their own imperial courier services. Station relays, official badges, and food provisions were modelled on what the Mongols had perfected. In China, remnants of the system influenced Ming dynasty courier stations. Though the Ming rejected their Mongol predecessors in many ways, they couldn't ignore the logistical genius of the yam. Routes were redrawn, but the framework remained. And in the 19th century American West, more than 500 years later, the Pony Express would be hailed as a marvel of speed and courage. Riders crossing hostile terrain, swapping horses at relay stations, delivering messages across vast distances. But even at its peak, the Pony Express lasted just 18 months. The yam had lasted over a century, and it had covered 10 times the distance. The Mongols never bragged about it. They didn't carve their postal system into marble or celebrate it in courtly poems. But it is, perhaps, one of their quietest triumphs. For every battle Genghis Khan won, there were dozens of messages that had to reach governors, generals, and city leaders, on time, intact, and often in poor weather. It wasn't glamorous. It was boring. It was precisely what held an empire together. And what of that last rider? Somewhere on the edges of the empire, perhaps in the desert stretches of the Gobi or the mountain passes of western China, there must have been one final courier, one final paisa, one last post to ride toward, unaware that no one was waiting on the other end. Did he stop, confused by the empty yurt? Did he turn back or keep riding? There are no records, only the distant hoofbeats lost to time. The yam's fall was not marked by collapse, but by silence, a silence so complete, so gradual, that history forgot to record its end. But for a brief, bright century, the Mongols stitched the world together with saddle straps, leather pouches, and goat milk ink. They built not just an empire, but a communications dream, one the world would not match for centuries. And perhaps, in that final wind-blown yurt, there still lies an unopened letter, waiting for someone to pass by and ask, what message was so important it had to cross the world? You might imagine that being a god on Mount Olympus came with perks, eternal youth, infinite power, ambrosia on tap, and for the most part, you'd be right. But if you asked Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry, madness, and occasional theatre, festivals, he might have offered a slightly different take, something between a wistful sigh and a hiccup. Because at one point, Dionysus tried to quit. This is a story less often told in the blazing epics. It doesn't involve Trojan horses or thunderbolts hurled from clouds. It's a slower tale, a quieter one. It begins, fittingly, with a hangover. Now, Dionysus was not just the god of wine, but also its invention. That distinction matters. While his siblings on Olympus presided over seas and skies, war and wisdom, Dionysus brought fermentation. He gave the Greeks the gift of grape transformation, of sunlight stored in fruit and unlocked in vats. He was worshipped not only in palaces, but in vineyards and among shepherds, actors, and anyone with a clay cup. But the job came with side effects. For centuries, he had poured himself, sometimes literally, into the lives of mortals, appearing at festivals, inspiring cults, laughing in taverns, weeping on mountaintops. His following was passionate, chaotic, and prone to tearing things apart, sometimes metaphorically and sometimes not. The Maenads, his female followers, were famous for entering trances and on occasion dismembering things they didn't quite understand. At first, Dionysus enjoyed the chaos. After all, he was a liminal god, a figure who straddled opposites, male but effeminate, divine but often mistaken, for mortal, joyful but deeply acquainted with grief. He was born twice, first of mortal Semele, then again from Zeus's thigh. He knew death. He had travelled the underworld, and still he chose to laugh. But even gods, it turns out, get tired. The tipping point came after a particularly long Dionysia festival in Athens. It had started with theatrical performances, tragedies first, then comedies, before dissolving into a week-long celebration of wine, masks, and impromptu street poetry. For mortals, it was the peak of religious joy. For Dionysus, it felt like work. The prayers were slurred, the offerings poorly measured, and the actors kept forgetting their lines. One morning, perhaps around the 5th day, he found himself sitting on a hillside just outside the city, alone. A half-finished amphora sat beside him. A crown of ivy drooped from his curls. A donkey nearby was chewing on what might have once been his sandal. He stared at the horizon for a long time, and then he said, quietly, to no one in particular, "I think I'd like to stop now." What does it mean for a god to stop? To retire? There was no paperwork, no divine HR department. But Dionysus knew of a place, a kind of spiritual halfway house, where gods sometimes went when they needed a break. This was not Mount Olympus, nor the underworld. It was a place whispered about among immortals, a grove of deep sleep, guarded by satyrs who had grown too philosophical to frolic, where gods could retreat into dreams without consequence. He sent word, discreetly, to Hypnos, the god of sleep. The reply came in a dream, with the scent of poppies and a barely audible yawn. Come whenever, there's space. Before leaving, Dionysus took one last stroll through the mortal world. He visited a vineyard in Naxos where old vines twisted in the wind. He stopped by a theatre in Thebes where children rehearsed a play in his honour, getting every myth wrong but laughing anyway. He watched a young man propose to a woman under a fig tree, offering her wine in a chipped goblet. He smiled, but it was a tired smile. Then he walked into the hills where the satyrs waited. The grove was quiet. Time passed strangely there. Dionysus lay down beneath an olive tree and closed his eyes. Dreams came, soft, spiraling, like smoke from an amphora. The satyrs brought him honey cakes, but he rarely ate. Occasionally he'd mutter a line from a play. Sometimes he cried in his sleep. Mortal worship of Dionysus didn't stop entirely, but it grew quieter. His festivals became more about theatre than frenzy. His wine cups were raised more in remembrance than invocation. He didn't mind. Retirement suited him. But elsewhere, on Olympus, his absence was noticed. Ares grunted that the mortals were getting boring. Apollo offered to take over the arts, which made the muses collectively roll their eyes. Hera, as usual, sniffed disapprovingly and muttered about the lack of decorum. But it was Hermes, clever, wing-sandaled Hermes, who decided to investigate. He found Dionysus asleep beneath the tree, vines curling gently around his ankles. "You're not dead," Hermes observed, "just extremely horizontal." Dionysus cracked one eye open. "I'm dreaming of silence. It's lovely." "But the world's changing," Hermes said, kneeling. "The Romans are coming. They have different names for us. They'll call you Bacchus." Dionysus sighed. "They can call me whatever they like, as long as they don't ask me to judge a chariot race." Hermes grinned. "They're building cities, theatres, bathhouses. There's a temple being planned just for you, in marble no less." Dionysus didn't respond at first. A cicada buzzed softly in the warm air. Then he whispered, Do they still remember how to dance? Hermes tilted his head. Some do, but it's different, slower, less wild. Dionysus closed his eyes again. Let them build their temples. I'll return when they forget how to laugh at themselves. And he did, but not yet. For now, he slept. Not out of laziness, but because sometimes even the god of revelry needs a moment of quiet. The kind of silence that seeps into your bones and reminds you why laughter matters, why joy is sacred, why even for a god, eternity must include rest. But eventually, the world would change enough to rouse him, and when he woke, gently, reluctantly, it wouldn't be to thunder or war, but to something stranger. The clinking of Roman goblets, a mispronounced prayer, and a vine-covered stage where a tragic actor stumbled through a scene that wasn't supposed to be funny. Dionysus would blink, smile crookedly, and stretch his arms. But that is a story for the next part. When Dionysus finally stirred from his unusually long divine nap, the world was not quite as he'd left it. The olive groves were still there, but many had been razed to make way for roads. The shepherds still sang, but now in Latin. The laughter still rang out from taverns, but now it was accompanied by togas, aqueducts, and rather opinionated senators. And his name, apparently, was now Bacchus. It's difficult to overstate how baffling this was for a god who had, for centuries, enjoyed being called Dionysus, a name with a rich backstory, one born from stormy myths, double births, and ecstatic cults. But the Romans had other plans. Bacchus, they said cheerfully, waving goblets. Our favourite god of wine and parties. It was well intended, if reductive. They even built him new temples, majestic ones, lined with marble columns and crowned with grapevine reliefs. His image appeared on mosaics, murals, amphorae, and even coins. But something felt wrong. Gone were the trance dances of the Maenads. Absent were the dishevelled satyrs with poetry on their breath. What remained was a curated, heavily Romanized version of Dionysus. In the forum, senators invoked Bacchus not in mystery or ecstasy, but with well-timed political toasts. He'd become, Dionysus realized, a mascot for elite merrymaking. He wandered the streets of Rome in disguise, which was easy for a shapeshifter. Sometimes he appeared as a weary traveler, other times as a street performer or a wine merchant. Nobody recognized him, not even the priests at his own temples. One afternoon, he found himself in the Subura district, Rome's chaotic heart, full of noise, dust, and people perpetually trying to sell you something. It reminded him a little of old Athens, if Athens had more pickpockets and fewer philosophers. At a street corner, a flutist played a tune he recognized, just a few notes from an old Dionysian hymn. The man played badly, but sincerely. Dionysus paused. He sat beside the musician, who glanced at him and smiled with the sort of tired friendliness that only comes from someone who's played the same melody for hours without earning a single sestertius. "Do you know who that song is for?" Dionysus asked. The flutist blinked. "It's for Bacchus, of course, the god of wine and circus games." "And do you know where he came from?" The flutist shrugged. "From a noble family of gods, I suppose, like all the good ones." Dionysus sighed. He thanked the man and walked on. Later, in a forum wine shop, he eavesdropped on a conversation between two mid-level bureaucrats. They were sipping diluted wine and discussing the upcoming Bacchanalia, a series of wild rites allegedly held in his honor, except it wasn't quite right. The Bacchanalia had become infamous. Roman officials, suspicious of anything involving secret rites and excessive joy, had cracked down on them in 186 BCE. The Senate issued a decree, the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, that essentially regulated joy out of existence. The rites were permitted only under tight control. No more than 5 participants, no money exchanged, and a detailed application submitted in triplicate to the Praetor Urbanus. Revelry, it turned out, now required a permit. Dionysus, Bacchus now, apparently, felt something akin to indigestion. The Maenads had once danced barefoot in the forests, calling down divine madness under the moon. Now, joy came with paperwork. He wondered, had he been gone too long? In time, he decided to speak with the only entity that might understand. Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings, endings, and transitions. If anyone could explain Rome's evolving spiritual climate, it would be the god who literally faced in both directions. Janus received Dionysus in his temple at dawn. One face smiled, the other frowned. "You've been sleeping," said the smiling face. "Too long," said the other. "I didn't think the world would change so much," Dionysus admitted. "They still offer me wine, but they don't know why. They speak my name, but it isn't mine." Janus shrugged in a way that used both shoulders independently. "The Romans are tidy people," said the happy face. "They like their gods to fit into categories." "They like order," said the other. "You were never orderly." Dionysus nodded. "They think I'm about parties, but I'm also about grief, about transformation, about the thin line between joy and madness." "They don't want that," said Janus, both faces briefly in agreement. Dionysus looked out the temple window. Below, the streets filled with vendors. Priests passed by in clean robes. Someone was arguing about drainage. "I think," he said slowly, "I'd like to remind them." Janus raised an eyebrow, both of them. "And how will you do that?" Dionysus gave a tired smile. "With theatre, of course." Over the following weeks, a peculiar new troupe appeared in the forum. They performed strange, hauntingly beautiful plays with masks and improvised hymns. Their scripts were old, their melodies older. They didn't charge money. They simply arrived, performed, and vanished. The Romans watched, unsure whether to laugh or cry, sometimes both. One night during a full moon, they reenacted the myth of Dionysus descending to the underworld to rescue his mother, Semele. It ended with a haunting chorus sung by actors wearing ivy crowns, swaying gently as if in trance. When the play ended, a child in the crowd asked, "Who was that god again?" An old woman whispered, "Dionysus. They used to call him Dionysus, not Bacchus, not just wine." The memory was returning. Still, the Bacchanalia never regained their original spirit. Rome remained Rome. The Senate remained skeptical. But among the people, in alleys, on farms, and in quiet garden theatres, the older god returned in whispers. His name resurfaced in songs and in festivals that no longer asked permission. Dionysus didn't need statues or altars. He just needed to be remembered properly. And yet, something lingered unresolved. He had re-entered the world. But did he belong to it anymore? As empires rose and fell, as temples were built and abandoned, he found himself haunted by a new feeling. Not exhaustion, but displacement. The old world was vanishing. The gods were being forgotten, rebranded, or folded into saints and symbols. Would Dionysus find a new place in this changing world? Or would he, like many old deities, fade quietly into myth? You find yourself in the middle of an olive grove at twilight. The air is sweet with crushed thyme and fermenting grapes. A satyr snores gently under a fig tree. Somewhere in the near distance, a lyre is being plucked. Hesitant notes, like someone remembering a song they haven't played in years. This is the place Dionysus built for himself after the Roman years. A space between worlds, quiet and untroubled. Neither Olympus nor Earth. A retreat, not out of petulance but weariness. Even gods, it turns out, can tire of misunderstanding. By the 3rd century CE, Rome had changed. Again. The empire had split, reunified, frayed at the edges, and embraced new religions. The rise of Christianity, especially under Constantine, had led to a sharp decline in the old ways. Temples were closed, Statues of gods were toppled or quietly repurposed. Public bacchanalia were declared not just outdated, but dangerous. To many, Dionysus, now Bacchus more than ever, had become a frivolous god of drunkenness, decadent feasts, and dangerous passions. A cautionary tale more than a source of worship. Even his deeper meanings, the god of transformation, of death and rebirth, of divine madness, had been buried beneath layers of satire and simplification. To Dionysus, it felt like being trapped in a mask that no longer fit. So he walked. First, through the forests of Thrace, where the Maenads no longer danced. Then along the old goat paths of Arcadia, where shepherds once whispered prayers over their flocks. He passed through abandoned sanctuaries, stepped over wine-dark stains left by centuries of forgotten offerings, and quietly slipped into non-existence. Not death, not even exile. Just stillness. He let the world move on without him, and for a time it did. But myth, like fermentation, is patient. Centuries passed, then came a flicker, barely noticeable at first. A Renaissance painter in Florence with a fondness for myth included a plump, sleepy-eyed Bacchus in the corner of a fresco. A playwright in England mentioned him in a comedic aside, mistaking him for a glutton. A poet in Germany invoked him as a symbol of divine ecstasy, only to immediately apologize to his pastor. In the 18th century, European salons revived his name, not reverently, but romantically. They liked the aesthetic of him: ivy wreaths, bare feet, a goblet raised under moonlight. But few recalled the full story, that he was born from fire, that he rescued his mother from the underworld, that he had once stood trial before kings and triumphed not by strength, but by unsettling joy. Still, Dionysus stirred. He noticed something strange. Artists and philosophers began to circle around ideas he'd always represented. Transformation, excess, the collapse of order into beauty. They wrote of the Dionysian as a force, even when they no longer believed in gods. Nietzsche, in particular, gave him a kind of second life, not as a deity, but as a metaphor. The chaotic, the ecstatic, the primal force beneath the veneer of civilization, paired eternally with Apollo, the god of order and logic. The two forces forever at odds, and yet eternally entwined. Dionysus raised an eyebrow when he read that. He'd never thought of Apollo as the neat one. In his experience, Apollo could be quite the drama queen. Still, he appreciated the attention. By the 20th century, Dionysus found himself attending literature lectures and experimental plays. He wore jeans now. No one recognized him, which was fine. He sat in the back rows and listened. Sometimes, on university campuses, he felt a familiar spark in the air, when students danced under string lights, barefoot on warm grass, trying to conjure joy without permission. He smiled then. It wasn't worship, but it was something. And yet, despite this cultural comeback, he never fully returned to Olympus. He didn't resume his place among the pantheon, didn't demand temples, didn't seek followers. He changed too, maybe being misunderstood, for centuries had reshaped him. Maybe he no longer needed the rituals and processions, or maybe, just maybe, he preferred being an idea, because ideas travel quietly. Ideas don't need altars. Ideas slip into songs, stories, artworks, and human longing. And Dionysus, more than any other god, understood the power of longing. It was, after all, what had shaped him from the beginning. His mortal mother longing for Zeus, her tragic end, his divine rebirth from flame and thigh, his lifelong search for belonging, moving between gods and mortals, always on the edge. He was never fully at home in Olympus or on Earth. He was in the liminal places, the crossroads, the vine growing between stones. Some say he still walks among us, not in temples, but in jazz bars at midnight, in the breath before a poem is spoken aloud, in the flicker of candlelight. At a festival you didn't know was sacred. He doesn't ask for offerings anymore. He asks only to be remembered, not as Bacchus, not as a symbol of revelry, but as he truly was, a god who danced, who wept, who transformed and was transformed, the god who once tried to retire and then quietly became immortal again, this time as myth. You're standing beneath the high arched dome of an Ottoman barracks. It's early morning in Edirne, sometime in the mid-17th century, and the cold stone floor beneath your feet is swept clean. There is no loud clamour here, just the soft scrape of sandals, the whisper of fabric, the murmur of recited verses. The men who move through these halls are part of the empire's most elite military corps, the Janissaries, and among them is a man with an unusual secret. His name is Mehmed bin Yusuf. He is neither famous nor infamous, and his name will not be found in grand military records or poetic chronicles. But in a cramped wooden chest beneath his cot, Mehmed keeps something unexpected, a growing collection of flutes, reed flutes, bone flutes, ceramic flutes from Persian merchants, and even a carved bamboo one that smells faintly of cinnamon. He polishes them before dawn, wrapping them in linen cloth scented with cloves. To the rest of the corps, Mehmed is a disciplined, if slightly reserved member of the 66th Orta, the infantry unit tasked with ceremonial guard duty and occasional urban policing. But when no one is looking, he plays soft, improvisational melodies, not for performance, but for peace. To understand how a flute-playing soldier came to be, we must rewind. The Janissaries were not born into their ranks. In fact, Mehmed, like most of his peers, had been recruited or taken, depending on your point of view, through the Devshirme system. As a boy from the Christian Balkans, likely from what is now North Macedonia, he had been taken from his family, converted to Islam, and raised within the strict but often surprisingly humane structures of the Janissary Corps. He learned to read, to pray, to march, and to fight. But he also learned music. Not in formal classes, but through osmosis, through the rhythms of marching drums, the chants of Sufi mystics, the wandering musicians at market stalls, and the haunting call to prayer that echoed through stone alleys. Music seeped into Mehmed's bones before he even knew he loved it. The Ottomans were no strangers to music. Unlike some of their contemporaries, they viewed it not merely as entertainment, but as a science and a therapy. In the courts of the sultans, music was performed to calm melancholia, to encourage digestion, even to lull infants to sleep. The great hospitals of Edirne used melodic modes, makams, as a form of treatment. There were physicians who prescribed compositions the way others prescribed poultices. And while Janissaries were, in theory, expected to devote themselves entirely to military service, the reality was more nuanced. They were craftsmen, cooks, calligraphers, poets, and in rare cases like Mehmed's, musicians in secret. But the flute was something else. It was not part of the bombastic meta-military band with its cymbals and kettle drums. It was soft, solitary, personal, and so Mehmed kept it private. His comrades respected him. He could march 20 miles without complaint and slice a hanging melon clean in half with his sabre. He didn't laugh much, but he listened well. In their barracks, he was the one who stitched torn uniforms without being asked, the one who brewed a more palatable coffee by sneaking in crushed cardamom pods. Still, he kept a distance, apart, of himself quiet. And every so often, in the dark before reveille, he would press the reed flute to his lips and play a few notes, just enough to feel like he still belonged to something beyond his uniform. There's a tension in this life, between duty and identity, between silence and expression. And nowhere was this tension clearer than in the spring of 1657, when rumours began to circulate through the camp. The Sultan was displeased. The Janissaries were growing too powerful, too independent. There were whispers of purges, of reassignments, of sudden accusations of un-Janissary-like behaviour. Mehmed, polishing a small clay whistle from Konya, felt his stomach tighten. He had never openly defied regulations, but he knew if someone were to open his chest and find not arms, but instruments, he would have much to explain. And the Janissaries were not known for tolerating eccentricities. In fact, they were growing more politicized, more hierarchical, and less forgiving of deviation. Already, Mehmed had seen a fellow soldier disciplined for reading unapproved poetry. It was not the world it once was. He considered burning the flutes or mailing them away, anonymously, to a Sufi lodge that might care for them. But he did neither. Instead, he wrapped each one in silk, tucked them deep beneath his uniforms, and went about his duties with more precision than ever. And then, one night, something happened that would change everything, not just for Mehmed, but for the quiet traditions he tried to protect. It was a full moon inspection. The commander, a grim man with a stiff beard and a fondness for discipline, had ordered random footlockers opened. Mehmed's unit was last in line. The torchlight flickered, the locks clicked. The officer's hand reached into Mehmed's chest and pulled out a flute, a cracked one. Bone, simple, worn from years of handling. There was a long pause. Mehmed braced for punishment, for ridicule, for worse. But instead the officer turned the flute in his hand, examined it, and said something Mehmed didn't expect. "My grandfather used to play one of these, said it calmed the sheep." He set it back in the chest and walked on. That night, Mehmed didn't sleep. He didn't play either, but he stared at the flute for hours, unsure whether he had just been spared or seen a glimmer of a world that still had room for softness. Because even in militaries, especially in militaries, there are men who remember sheep, and that perhaps was the beginning of something, not a revolution, not even a change in regulation, just a quiet opening, a moment in which Mehmed realized he might not be the only Janissary with a secret tune inside him. But who were the others, and how, if ever, could he find them? You follow Mehmed now through the winding lanes of Edirne on his weekly leave. The year is still 1657, and spring has crept across the city in perfumed silence. The stone roads are lined with carpet stalls and shadowed by the narrow balconies of wood-framed houses. Minarets pierce the soft blue sky, and somewhere, far off, the sound of a zurna, shrill and festive, trills over a wedding procession. Mehmed is walking calmly, his Janissary insignia covered by a long charcoal-coloured overcoat. He carries no weapon, no badge of rank. But in the crook of his arm is a cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside it is not a scroll, nor a prayer rug, but a ney, flute, carved of aged reed and etched faintly with Ottoman calligraphy. He walks with purpose, but not haste, ducking into side streets that smell of roasted eggplant and ash. At a corner where a mosque once stood, now only a crumbled fountain and a mulberry tree remain. Here, Mehmed pauses. Beneath the tree sits an old kebab vendor with no customers. His name is Selim. Selim is not, in fact, a vendor. Not exactly. His charcoals burn low, and his skewers remain neatly stacked, untouched. He sells kebabs when it rains. The rest of the time, he watches. "Wind from the south today," Selim murmurs as Mehmed approaches. "Better for the reeds," Mehmed replies, and drops a coin into the vendor's jar. Selim nods toward a narrow alley. Moment later, Mehmed slips through a small arched wooden door behind a tailor's stall, down 2 short steps, and into what once might have been a storage cellar. It is dim and cool, lit only by a hanging lamp whose flame flickers against carved stone walls. There is a small niche in one wall with a water jug and a single cup. No decorations, no seats, no guards. But there are sounds. Soft, low tones, drums, plucked strings, the occasional sharp intake of breath as someone misses a note. It's here that Mehmed meets others like himself. They come irregularly. A few are Janissaries, though none ever say so directly. Some are old dervishes from outlying lodges. One man claims to be a retired stable master, another speaks Persian with a faint Armenian accent. None use names. What unites them is a love of music and the need for discretion. Ottoman society, while richly cultured, was full of contradictions. Music was revered in some circles and frowned upon in others. The imperial court sponsored entire orchestras, yet many provincial scholars dismissed instruments as idle vanities. Sufi mystics embraced melody as a path to God. Orthodox clerics warned against temptation in its patterns. For the Janissaries, the contradiction was sharper still. Their official music, the Mater Band, was thunderous, brash, martial. It marched with the armies, blaring cymbals and shrieking horns, terrifying enemies as far as Hungary. But what Mehmed and his companions practiced here in the cellar was different. They played makams, modal scales believed to evoke specific emotional states. Some were meant to cool anger, others to ease digestion or quiet the heart. The makam called Husseini was known to still children's fears. Segar soothed loneliness. They played slowly, carefully, often improvising, listening more than performing. It was not concert music. It was communion. None of them spoke much, though over time, Mehmed came to recognize the distinct touch of each player, the way the oud player always hesitated a half beat before the cadence, or how the old ney player liked to end on an unresolved note, as if he refused to let the song be over. It was in this cellar on a rainy May evening that Mehmed first played a melody he had composed himself. He called it The Road to Skopje. It wasn't complex, just a slow rise and fall, like a hill path winding through dry grass. It was built around a single motif he'd first heard as a boy, sung by his mother while threshing grain. The others said nothing, but when he finished, the oud player hummed the last phrase softly, a kind of acknowledgement. It was the only applause he would ever want. By day, Mehmed remained the disciplined janissary. Clean boots, crisp formation, efficient sword drills. His commander never again mentioned the flute. But in the evenings, Mehmed began to notice subtle changes around the barracks. One night, while polishing his boots, he heard a rhythmic tapping from the far end of the dormitory. Someone keeping time. A code. Another time, he passed a younger recruit quietly humming a melody he recognized from the cellar. Disguised, but present. It was as if a thread of quiet resistance was being tugged, and others had begun to follow its vibrations. Not rebellion. No, one spoke of abandoning duty, but a shared hunger for softness. And then, one evening, something strange happened. Mehmed returned from the cellar to find a folded scrap of parchment on his cot. No signature, just a short phrase, written in clear, bold script. The dervish's reed sings loudest in silence. Room 11, Mosque of the Lamp. He stared at the note for a long time. The Mosque of the Lamp, so named for the ancient oil lamp that had burned continuously in its alcove since the time of Suleiman, was not far. Just past the bookbinder's quarter. Room 11 was likely one of the study rooms above the side prayer hall. He considered ignoring it. It could be a trap, or a test. But something inside him stirred, a curiosity that overrode caution. Later that night, beneath a thinning crescent moon, he made his way through Edirne's sleeping streets, the note still clutched in his palm. What he would find there, who had written the note, and why, was unknown. But he felt for the first time, not alone in his secrecy, not deviant, but part of something. What kind of brotherhood could exist in silence? And what price might be paid for playing one note too many? You return with Mehmed, now to the Mosque of the Lamp. The night is still cool, the stars above Edirne's domes barely flickering in the breeze. The city's call to prayer has long since faded into silence, and the streets are hushed. Only the gentle swish of a cat's tail against a cobblestone corner marks his passage. He stands for a moment outside the mosque's weathered walls. A faint glimmer shines from within. A single oil lamp in the prayer alcove, its flame remarkably still. He enters quietly, barefoot. his steps echoing just slightly along the smooth marble. Up a narrow side staircase, down a short corridor, and there, room 11, a wooden door with a brass handle, neither locked nor ajar. Inside it is almost bare. A few cushions, a water jug, and 3 men seated on the floor. One of them, an elderly man with a face creased like folded silk, is holding a ney. The others gesture for Mehmed to sit. No names are offered, no questions asked. Then the elder begins to play. The sound is so delicate it seems to unravel time. The melody is unfamiliar, slow, inquisitive, and curved like script on a manuscript's margin. It wanders and lingers, occasionally hesitating before finding its way again. When he finishes, he simply nods. "You have been heard," says the man to Mehmed's left. "What you play," adds the other, "should be preserved." The next few months pass quietly, but change stirs beneath the surface. Mehmed begins to transcribe his compositions onto parchment, not just for himself, but for something larger, something archival. His notes are precise, full of fingering instructions, breath marks, even the time of day each piece was conceived. He learns that the old man is known as Hamza Effendi, a former court musician who once performed in the presence of Sultan Murad. It was said he could play the entire Bayati Makam without taking a breath. The others are scribes, physicians, and one surprising guest, a retired palace gardener who once tuned wind chimes made of ceramic and copper. He claims plants grow better if you hum rast makam while pruning. They call themselves the companions of the reed, not formally, but in jest. They meet irregularly, always in different places. The upper floor of a bathhouse, an abandoned caravanserai, even the shadowed corner of a shipbuilder's yard near the river, and always quiet music, scribbled notes, unspoken understanding. But the janissaries are changing. The core, once elite and feared, has grown swollen with politics. Internal factions emerge, and the dev-shirme system, through which boys like Mehmed were once recruited, is slowly being phased out. Bribery and nepotism creep in, discipline loosens. One day, a fellow janissary named Kamal finds Mehmed's music, notes folded beneath his cot. Kamal says nothing at first, just raises an eyebrow. But the next week, he hands Mehmed a flute carved from dark walnut. "Made it myself," Kamal mutters. "Don't ask how." And so the circle widens. They do not plan revolution. They are not heretics. They serve their duties, polish their swords, stand guard on palace walls. But at night, they hum lullabies in ancient scales. Years pass. Hamza Effendi dies quietly one spring morning. A short notice is posted in the bazaar. Mehmed attends the funeral and places a small reed flute beside the grave. No one questions it. Around the same time, an imperial edict bans non-meta music from being practiced within military quarters. Instruments are confiscated. Musicians are interrogated. Some flee to Sufi lodges. Others stop playing altogether. Mehmed, now older, is summoned by a mid-level officer who heard a rumor. "You are familiar with the ney?" the officer asks casually. Mehmed nods. "Good. His Majesty is seeking someone to play for the new princes. Naming ceremony. Quietly, something tasteful, not percussive." It is an odd request, but Mehmed understands. A week later, in a silk-draped chamber lit by lanterns and cooled with sandalwood fans, Mehmed plays for the Sultan's family. Just one piece, The Road to Skopje. When he finishes, no one claps. But the Grand Vizier closes his eyes for a moment too long. A eunuch bows silently. And the child's mother smiles, barely perceptibly. That night, Mehmed receives a silver medallion. No words, no title. Just a seal pressed into wax. A reed, crossed, with a sword. He continues his service for years. Quietly, respectfully. His music remains informal, his flutes unregistered. When he finally retires from the Janissary Corps, his file notes only that he was competent in drills, consistent in obedience, and unusually quiet. he returns to the countryside. There, among olive trees and dusty trails, he builds a small room, just large enough for 3 cushions, 1 jug of water, and a low shelf for instruments. He never marries. But sometimes travellers arrive with instruments wrapped in cloth. They stay a night or 2, then disappear again. And when Mehmed finally dies, old, content, and humming a makam no one has named, his house is left unlocked. Inside, the shelf remains. 22 flutes, each one wrapped in linen, each bearing a small note. The name of the melody it was used to play, the season, the direction of the wind, a quiet archive of a quiet resistance. And though the Janissaries themselves would one day be disbanded, their memory twisted by politics and war, somewhere, buried in the dusty footnotes of military registries and forgotten melodies, there remains a line. Some soldiers held swords, others held breath, and perhaps that too is a form of service. Let's begin by imagining the Sahara, not as a place of blistering sun and merciless dunes, but as something altogether quieter. The wind, for now, has settled. The sand is still. It is early morning, and the city of Timbuktu has just begun to stir. Here, on the edge of the desert, where golden dust gathers like forgotten thoughts, a man in soft blue robes is unlocking the front door of a modest mud brick building. This is not a market or a mosque, but a library, and not just any library. This is the Ahmed Baba Institute, one of many that have, over centuries, made Timbuktu one of the least likely scholarly capitals in world history. Inside, there is no grandeur, just rows of wooden shelves, the smell of parchment, and the slow, deliberate work of preservation. A young apprentice is gently brushing sand off a leather-bound manuscript with the edge of a pigeon feather. Somewhere in the back room, an elder is murmuring aloud in Arabic, cross-checking a citation on camel anatomy. This is where we begin our soft-spoken stroll, through the long, dry corridors of a city that once taught law beneath salt lamps, composed love poems in calligraphy, and charted the stars using cowrie shells and quiet observation. Welcome to Timbuktu. In the Western imagination, Timbuktu is often treated like a metaphor for the middle of nowhere, a punchline for far-off places. But for centuries, particularly during the 14th to 16th centuries, it was nowhere near nowhere. It was the intellectual and spiritual heart of West Africa. Its location was deliberate. Timbuktu sat at the intersection of trans-Saharan trade routes, connecting the Sahel to North Africa, the Mediterranean, and even the distant cities of Mecca and Cairo. Caravans carrying salt, gold, ivory, and textiles also carried ideas, religious texts, philosophical tracts, and, most preciously, paper. Paper was not native to this region. It came from Egypt and Morocco, transported carefully in camel caravans that could stretch for miles across the desert. In an age before the printing press reached this part of Africa, books were precious cargo. But here, unlike in some parts of the world, they were not just owned. They were copied, by hand, slowly, meticulously, over and over again. Timbuktu's first major library is thought to have arisen alongside the Sankore University Mosque, which dates back to the 14th century. Unlike modern universities with lecture halls and bureaucracies, Sankore was more organic, rooted in the Islamic tradition of scholarship through study circles. A teacher would sit under a tree or in the mosque's shaded courtyard, and his students would gather around him, each taking notes with wooden boards and charcoal ink. Manuscripts in Timbuktu weren't just religious, though many were. They also covered astronomy, botany, music theory, medicine, law, and even how to maintain civil discourse with your neighbour over shared water rights. Some included diagrams of surgical tools, others marginal doodles of horses or geometric shapes. But perhaps what's most quietly surprising is the tone of many of these texts. There's a softness to them, a kind of elegant, precise calm. Take, for instance, a letter written in the 15th century by a scholar named Al-Wangari. to a rival in Walata. The letter begins not with threats or theological rebukes, but with, "Brother, may your ink never run dry, and your camels find easy wind." Even disagreements were often laced with compliments. At its height, Timbuktu is believed to have held upwards of 700,000 manuscripts, dispersed across dozens of private libraries and scholarly households. It wasn't unusual for a wealthy family to own hundreds of texts, passed down from generation to generation, each one carefully annotated in the margins by successive readers. Imagine, for a moment, inheriting not just your grandfather's house or name, but his reading notes. A comment on astronomy scribbled in 1487 beside a paragraph on planetary rotation. A line in Fulani added in 1532 next to an Arabic passage on water purification. These margins became conversations across time, one reader to another, grandparent to grandchild, scholar to apprentice. But perhaps what is most endearing about Timbuktu's literary life is just how much effort was spent on recording the ordinary. One manuscript from the 16th century, known simply as the Book of Useful Trades, includes instructions on how to dye leather using indigo, how to polish copper bowls using a lemon rind, and how to construct a lightweight fishing net from desert grasses. Another scroll records rainfall patterns over 30 years in the village of Jenne. Someone, likely with ink-stained fingers and a quiet temperament, recorded every drizzle and deluge as if the clouds themselves were authors. The practical and the poetic existed side by side. Meanwhile, in the dim interior of a scholar's house, the day would begin with tea. Mint, usually. Bitter at first, then sweet with each passing glass. Manuscripts would be unwrapped from cloth bundles, set upon wooden stands, and read aloud. Children might recite verses from the Quran 1 hour, then copy geometry diagrams the next. Older students would translate Arabic into Songhai or Tamashek, sometimes inventing new notations as they went. The work was slow. That was the point. In a society where time moved with the sun and the wind, rushing through a book was not seen as admirable. Speed suggested carelessness. A good student paused, reread, and considered the silences between sentences. But change would come. By the 17th century, external forces began to encroach. First Moroccan soldiers, then European traders, then colonial bureaucrats who failed to understand what they were looking at. To many, Timbuktu appeared small and dusty, not glittering with gold or bristling with industry. The libraries were ignored. Some books were stolen, others left to mildew in cellars. But the local families, quietly, patiently, protected what they could. They buried manuscripts in tin boxes beneath the floorboards. They smuggled them out in baskets of millet. Some wrapped pages in cloth and buried them in sealed clay jars outside the city, their locations passed down by whisper. The books survived, not because of empires, but because of ordinary people who believed knowledge should rest safely in quiet hands. Today, Timbuktu still stands, worn but resilient. Many of its manuscripts have been recovered, digitized, and restored. Others remain hidden, waiting. In the Ahmed Baba Institute, the air smells of old paper and lemon oil. A technician hums softly as he photographs a 15th century scroll about irrigation. Outside, the sand drifts lazily against the stone walls. And somewhere in a small courtyard, a child is learning to write her name with a reed pen. She dips it in ink. She pauses, and the story continues. The midday sun in Timbuktu does not roar. It simmers. Heat hangs in the air like a held breath, and the mud brick buildings of the city seem to melt quietly into the earth. But in the shaded corridors of Sankore and the neighbouring libraries, work hums along in low, papery tones. A quill scratches softly. A kettle whistles from an open window. The faint scent of ink, cloves, and sun-dried leather drifts through the courtyards. It is in this half-silent world that we now turn to a crucial, if humble figure, the scribe. To be a scribe in Timbuktu was not just to copy. It was to curate, to interpret, to preserve. A scribe did not rush. He or she selected the right ink for the season. Cooler months called for thicker ink, lest it dry too quickly. Chose paper or parchment appropriate to the text subject. Leather-bound for law, soft cotton rag for poetry. And always, always, left room in the margins for notes that might come centuries later. Some of the most prized scribes were women. Though rarely discussed in earlier Western accounts, recent manuscript studies have revealed female calligraphers whose precise penmanship and lyrical spacing earned them steady work and admiration. Their names were sometimes signed discreetly, initials, woven into decorative flourishes. Others went unnamed, but unmistakably left their style behind, recognizable by a gentle curve in the loop of the Arabic letter Ain, or the delicate patterning around key verses of Quranic surahs. These scribes formed a kind of invisible, scholarly class. Not professors exactly, but the foundation on which learning rested, and their workplace was not limited to mosque schools or libraries. The real intellectual heartbeat of Timbuktu pulsed, most vividly in its markets. Imagine stepping into the market square of Timbuktu around the year 1520. The streets are unpaved, dusty but swept. Donkeys shuffle by, laden with firewood. Vendors sit cross-legged beneath canopies, selling salt, slabs freshly cracked from mines hundreds of miles north in Tagaza. The salt glints pale and angular, stacked like sleepy dominoes. Among the fish stalls and weavers' looms, another vendor has laid out something more delicate. Books, bound in camel leather, bundled with coloured string, wrapped in linen cloth. They sit in neat rows atop woven mats. Buyers arrive in sandals and sandals of thought, scholars, merchants, imams, curious teenagers. They kneel quietly, untie a bundle, open a page, no shouting here, just the whisper of pages being turned. Books were not just purchased, they were bartered, studied, and often loaned out in exchange for a favour, a basket of dates, or future access to another manuscript. One 16th century letter describes a transaction in which a manuscript on rainfall patterns was lent out in return for a live chicken, with the understanding that if the chicken survived the month, the borrower could keep the book. In many cases, ownership of a manuscript was communal. A family, or even an entire neighbourhood, would pool funds to commission a copy. Once completed, it would live in a local mosque or home and be made available to others by appointment or quiet request. It's estimated that by the late 1500s, Timbuktu had more than 150 schools and learning circles, many of them informal yet deeply respected. A young student might attend morning lessons in law, afternoon study in natural philosophy, and spend the evening reading love poetry under lantern light. The poems annotated by scholars dead for 300 years. The subjects of these manuscripts were as vast and varied as the desert skies. There were manuals for doctors, describing how to treat burns using resin from the acacia tree, or how to measure a fever with the back of one's hand, and a poem of healing recited slowly. There were guides to navigating desert stars, some tracing their knowledge back to ancient Egyptian and Hellenistic texts, others blending indigenous Saharan lore with Islamic astronomy. Then there were dream books, manuals interpreting the meaning of one's nighttime visions. If you dreamed of a red goat, it meant travel. If a river ran backward, it meant your cousin owed you money. The interpretations were not absolute but suggestive, more art than science. Occasionally, these dream books were updated. A 17th century revision added a note suggesting that dreaming of Europeans wearing metal hats might portend drought or unwanted company. It's unclear if this was a political jab, a superstition, or just a moment of exasperation. But it wasn't. All books and ink. Timbuktu's status as a scholarly capital depended on something even less glamorous: salt and trade. Salt was, quite literally, the gold of the region. Pulled from the mines of Tagaza and transported by camel caravans, each slab weighed about 30 kilograms and could sell for the price of a cow. These slabs also stabilized Timbuktu's economy and, in turn, allowed its intellectual culture to flourish. The tax revenues from the salt trade were often invested into educational infrastructure. Scholars were provided stipends, mosques were maintained, roads, paths, were cleared and swept. And when a travelling scholar passed through, he could often find lodging simply by presenting a letter of introduction and a few verses memorized from Al-Ghazali or Ibn Khaldun. This gentle mingling of trade and thought made Timbuktu something quite rare in its time, a city where learning was not the province of kings and courts, but the pastime of merchants, artisans, and even the illiterate, who might still hear verses recited aloud at the market fountain or on the steps of a mosque at dusk. There is, tucked in the corner of one manuscript, a faint and almost forgettable note written in the Songhai language. A city without knowledge is a city without shade. The metaphor is apt. Shade was precious in Timbuktu. Trees were rare, but their presence marked places of gathering, conversation, and reflection. Likewise, books and knowledge offered relief from the burning sun of ignorance, not in dramatic fashion, but as a gentle, consistent coolness in the daily lives of its citizens. Even the architecture of Timbuktu reflects this quiet devotion to learning. Homes were often built with small recessed niches in the walls to store scrolls. Larger houses had entire rooms for manuscripts, with latticed windows to allow airflow but block dust. Clay pots filled with lavender and dried citrus helped keep moths and mold at bay. And if one passed through the streets late at night, one might spot a flicker of light in a scholar's window, not the blaze of ambition, but the soft pulse of someone, somewhere, reading by candle. The rhythm of Timbuktu was never rushed. Scholars taught for decades. Students took years to master a single text, and the libraries, dusty and stubborn, grew book by book, note by note, margin by margin. But by the end of the 16th century, things began to shift. The Moroccan invasion of 1591 changed more than politics. It disrupted the slow, deliberate life of scholarship. Manuscripts were stolen or burned. Scribes fled. Learning was pushed into back rooms and underground vaults. Still, the spirit persisted, and, as we close this second chapter in our stroll through Timbuktu, we might imagine one last image: a father and daughter sitting under the shade of a crumbling wall, quietly reciting a verse about the stars. Neither are famous, neither are remembered by name. But the verse, written 300 years earlier by someone equally obscure, lives on in the sound of their voices. The books are still whispering. If you were to walk the back alleys of Timbuktu today past, the sand-blown walls, the quiet rooftops strung with laundry, the half-faded murals of ancient scholars, you might not realize that you're brushing shoulders with a library, not one made of steel shelves and barcode scanners, but one embedded in houses, courtyards, closets, and the odd wooden trunk stored beneath a bed. Because Timbuktu's libraries never vanished entirely, they simply went underground. When Moroccan troops took control of the city in 1591, they sought to consolidate political power, and in doing so, often disrupted or outright dismantled the institutions of learning that had taken centuries to build. Some scholars were exiled, others imprisoned, and many manuscripts confiscated or destroyed. The city's golden age of open intellectual exchange began to dim, not with a bang, but with a slow closing of doors. But not all was lost. In the quiet defiance of memory and dust, many Timbuktians began a tradition of resistance that was not loud, not grand, but extremely effective. They hid the books. They hid them in clay pots buried under floors, behind loose bricks in courtyard, walls, in goatskin trunks passed down from grandmother to grandson. Manuscripts were wrapped in cloth and tucked behind shelves of spices or folded into old travel satchels. Some were sealed in jars along with lavender buds or cedar chips to deter insects and mold. One scholar even placed his most precious manuscripts under the floorboards of his grain storage room, reasoning that invading troops were unlikely to search among millet sacks. And this quiet resistance worked for centuries. But the preservation of these manuscripts was not just about hiding. It was about remembering how to care for them. The chain of knowledge had to be kept intact. Not just the content of the texts, but the methods of maintenance. how to recognize mold, how to mix ink for restoration, how to bind a spine without cracking the leather. These skills were passed down orally from older generations to younger ones, often within the same families. And it wasn't just men. As with the scribes of the Golden Age, many of the keepers of these hidden libraries were women, mothers and grandmothers who memorized entire indexes of books without needing to unroll a single page. One such woman, known only as Auntie Mariam in family lore, was said to have memorized the entire layout of a collection of over 300 books stored in 6 different households. When asked how she remembered it all, she simply replied, "I water them with my mind." Occasionally, a manuscript would be retrieved for use, a legal dispute that required citation of an old ruling, or a religious holiday that involved the recitation of certain prayers, but more often they were simply left to rest. And still they waited, wrapped in patience and cotton, for a time when they might once again be read aloud. That time would come centuries later during a period of quiet rediscovery. By the late 20th century, historians and linguists began to take serious interest in the hidden manuscripts of Timbuktu. Local scholars, long aware of their family treasures, began to collaborate with outside institutions, carefully, selectively, to help preserve what had survived. Some libraries emerged from hiding, their contents catalogued with soft pencils and cotton gloves. The most famous of these is the Ahmed Baba Institute, named for the 16th century scholar who was exiled to Morocco for refusing to comply with invaders. The institute became a symbol of revival, not just a library, but a laboratory of cultural memory. Rooms were constructed with humidity controls. Manuscripts were digitized using cameras rigged from lamps and cardboard. Volunteers trained in conservation work, learning how to repair pages using traditional Saharan techniques rather than imported chemicals. Michael charts from the 1300s, mapping the moons of Jupiter with surprising accuracy. Letters between merchants discussing trade rates on saffron, pepper, and ostrich eggs. Treatises on jurisprudence, ethics, and the rights of women in Islamic law. Some penned in meticulous decorative script. Others scrawled in the hurried hand of someone balancing a writing board on their knee. Some manuscripts were written in Classical Arabic, others in local languages like Songhai, Tamashek, or Fulani, using Arabic script. This diversity confused early Western researchers, who sometimes assumed such texts were illegible. In fact, they were simply written in literate systems that had thrived for hundreds of years before colonial eyes arrived. But the rediscovery of Timbuktu's manuscripts was not without peril. In 2012, during the northern Mali conflict, militant groups entered Timbuktu. Cultural heritage sites were targeted. Shrines were destroyed. Book burnings became a very real fear. But once again, Timbuktu's people resisted, not with weapons, but with whispering urgency. In a massive, mostly silent operation, thousands of manuscripts were smuggled out of the city, hidden in rice sacks, under piles of laundry, and in false-bottomed carts. The manuscripts were carried across desert roads by families who risked everything for pages most outsiders could not even read. One organizer described the process as a relay of trust. Families would pass the books from one safe house to another, often traveling only at night, covering hundreds of kilometers. The total number of manuscripts rescued in this operation is estimated at over $300,000, and many survived intact. Today, you can visit these manuscripts, not just in Timbuktu, but online. Digitized pages flutter like silent flags on library websites. Scholars are still translating and decoding, still finding notes in margins that reference forgotten events or lost proverbs. Some manuscripts were authored anonymously. Others are signed with full names, complete with ink-stamped seals and poetic flourishes. But nearly all of them whisper the same quiet message. We were here, we remembered, and we are still remembering. If you return to Timbuktu now and find yourself invited into a family home, you might be offered tea. 3 glasses, as tradition dictates, the first bitter, the second sweet, the third somewhere in between. And if your host senses that you are curious and kind, they might show you something stored under a bed or behind a curtain. A small, leather-wrapped bundle. A book, worn but unbroken. Inside, words written 600 years ago, ideas recorded with patient ink, not dramatic, not loud, not revolutionary, just calm, careful memory. And that, in the end, is what Timbuktu has always offered. A city that held onto its knowledge not through conquest or fame, but through silence, sand, and the quiet determination to remember. Let's say you're a young boy in the 16th century Balkans. You're the third son in a small Christian village tucked into the high hills of what is now northern Albania. You've spent your short life helping your mother keep chickens out of the garden and watching your older brothers try to fix leaky roofs. One spring morning, a group of uniformed men, calm, clean-shaven, and speaking in a dialect of Turkish you barely recognize, arrive with clipboards and turbans. Your father has already hidden your brothers, but you are not hidden fast enough. You're taken as part of the Dev Shurma, the Ottoman system of child levy, where Christian boys from the empire's European provinces were recruited, converted to Islam, and trained for service in the Sultan's elite corps. It was considered both a great loss and a strange honor. One day you may wear silks and carry swords, but first you must forget everything you know. And so begins your journey to becoming a janissary. The janissaries were the elite infantry of the Ottoman Empire, a corps unlike any other in the early modern world. They were known not just for their discipline in battle, but also for their unusual structure. For much of their early existence, they were forbidden to marry, to own property, or to grow beards. Their loyalty was absolute, not to any local noble, but directly to the Sultan himself. In theory, they were incorruptible, monks with muskets. In practice, they were also bureaucrats, musicians, poets, and, in the case of one particularly curious fellow we'll get to soon, instrument collectors. But let's begin with their training. Once selected, Devshirme boys were brought to Istanbul and placed in farms or households to learn Turkish and Islamic customs. Those who showed promise, meaning they didn't run away, sulk too much, or fall asleep while reciting the Quran, were sent to the palace schools. There, in between long hours of physical training, archery and prayer, they also learned languages, philosophy, and the proper way to wear 17 buttons on a ceremonial jacket without losing composure. Discipline was everything. If you were caught dozing during parade drills, you ran laps, forgot your regiment's prayer recitation, no dinner, showed up to musket cleaning with dirt on your hands, back to polishing boots, everyone's boots, but you also learned things no village farm could have taught. You saw maps of the known world, heard court musicians practicing long, meandering songs that sounded more like weather than music, and perhaps most surprisingly, you were taught to read and write in Ottoman. Turkish, a script so complex and curvy it seemed to move while you stared at it. You weren't just becoming a soldier, you were becoming an Ottoman. By the late 1500s, the Janissary Corps had grown into a force of many thousands. No longer limited to Christian-born recruits, they were increasingly drawn from within the empire itself. Their role had shifted from battlefield shock troops to guards, administrators, and enforcers of imperial calm. They lived in barracks that were almost monastic, tidy, well-ordered, quiet. Meals were shared in silence. Shoes were left by the door. Each janissary was responsible for his own pot. Yes, a literal cooking pot, which he polished and guarded with more devotion than some men gave their swords. The loss of one's pot was an actual disciplinary phrase. You did not want to lose your pot. Janissaries did not drink, in theory, did not gamble, in theory, and did not get married, in theory. What they did do was drill, march, read, pray, and occasionally, once the officer turned his back, learn how to play the ney, a long reed flute used in Sufi devotional music. This is where we begin to hear the quiet notes of a different kind, of soldier. Among the Janissaries posted to Edirne, a former capital of the empire and still a prestigious outpost, there lived a man named Halil of Prizren, though few called him that. His comrades called him Halil Nazan, Halil the flute man. Halil's official duties were standard for a mid-ranking janissary: guard duty, drill instruction, inventory management. But he had a secret hobby that was gradually becoming less secret. Collected flutes, not just nays, though he had several of them, each wrapped in velvet and oiled carefully after use. He also had bone flutes from the Caucasus, bamboo flutes from Persia, short whistles carved by shepherd boys in the mountains, even a rare Chinese xiao given to him by a visiting dignitary who, it was said, had been quite drunk at the time. Halil wasn't showy about it. He kept his instruments in a long chest beneath his cot, nestled between spare uniforms and sachets of cedar bark to keep the worms away. Some nights, after lights out, he would gently pull one out and play a tune so soft it barely rustled the shadows. No one punished him for it. In fact, many of the men found it soothing. One captain reportedly slept better when Halil played. Another swore it cured his heartburn. But there was one man, an ambitious quartermaster with a love of order, who believed that music had no place in a military dormitory. He reported Halil for flute hoarding. Rather than being punished, Halil was summoned to Istanbul. It was not a reprimand. It was a curiosity. The Sultan's advisors, upon hearing that one of their soldiers had amassed a collection of over 40 instruments and could play at least a dozen, invited him to perform in the Enderun, the inner court, of the Topkapi Palace, where musicians were highly respected. And thus, Halil of Prizren, foot soldier and quiet reed player, found himself playing lullabies before men in robes worth more than his yearly salary. But it wasn't flattery or fame that excited Halil. It was what he saw in the palace archives, flutes he'd only heard about, tucked away in gilded cases. There was a bronze whistle from Egypt shaped like a jackal's head, a bone-carved pipe allegedly used by Ottoman scouts in the time of Mehmed the Conqueror, and best of all, a double-barreled pan flute once played by itinerant entertainers. During the Festival of the Tulips, Halil did not steal them, but he did ask to catalogue them. To everyone's surprise, the court agreed, so he stayed in Istanbul, unofficially reassigned from garrison to gallery, from musket to music. He spent his days oiling old flutes, copying down tunings, and writing long marginalia on the differences between shepherd's breath and courtier's breath, a distinction he claimed could be measured by the way the wood warmed under one's fingers. His comrades occasionally wrote to him, their letters full of jokes about whether he'd finally married a clarinet. Halil always replied, politely and a little poetically, and though he remained a janissary to the end, never breaking his vow of celibacy, never growing a beard, and never ever losing his pot, he also left behind something few others did, an inventory of Ottoman musical instruments, meticulously recorded by a man who understood not only how to play them, but how to listen. You are still Halil of Prizren. Or perhaps you're simply one of his close colleagues now, imagining yourself wandering the corridors of Istanbul's Topkapi Palace in the spring of 1592. The marble stones beneath your sandals are just cool, enough to keep you awake, and the scent of rosewater and worn parchment mingles faintly in the air. You've served in the Janissary Corps long enough to know the difference between sounds meant for duty and those meant for pleasure. The stamp of boots on parade grounds, the thunk of a scabbard against a tiled column, the short clipped whistle that summons an entire platoon to attention. These belong to the realm of command. But there's a quieter discipline to Halil's world now. He is no longer posted to guard towers or given drill assignments. He resides in a small stone room off the Imperial Archives, technically still within the Janissary barracks compound, but so removed from daily regimental life that many forget he wears the same uniform. Instead of lining up muskets, he arranges flutes. Instead of memorizing battle formations, he maps airflow patterns across wooden reeds. And most curiously of all, Halil has begun to write down silence. You may think that's a metaphor. It is not. In the margins of his flute inventory, logs, written in the careful, compact Ottoman script taught to all palace-educated janissaries, Halil begins to annotate each instrument with what it sounds like when not played. One ivory pipe holds the stillness of dawn over Lake Van. A reed flute from Diyarbakir has the silence of figs being peeled. A short wooden whistle sounds like a soldier exhaling into his tea. The court scribes are perplexed. The chief musician, however, is not. Master Harun Effendi, a stern but curious Sufi-trained composer who oversees the palace's musical chamber, requests an audience. Halil prepares nervously, expecting reprimand. Instead, Harun Effendi asks him to elaborate. "What is the difference," he says, "between the sound a flute makes and the silence it leaves behind?" Halil answers as best he can. Sound is temporary, but the echo of it changes the space it fills. Some flutes, he believes, leave behind a hollow that reshapes how you hear your own thoughts. Harun Effendi nods. Then he hands Halil a new assignment. He is to inventory not just instruments, but acoustics. It's a strange job, even by Ottoman court standards. Equipped with a charcoal logbook and a rotating selection of borrowed flutes, Halil begins touring the palace complex. Galleries, baths, prayer halls, kitchens, tunnels. In each space, he plays a single sustained note, then listens. Not for the sound itself, but for how the room returns it. In the baths, the note flutters like pigeons' wings. In the old treasury, it sinks immediately, dampened by thick stone. In the Sultan's private garden, it hovers for a breath, then disappears as if embarrassed. Halil begins noting the personalities of rooms. The old tapestry hall has a forgiving echo, like a mother who already knows what you've done wrong. The underground cistern hums back, low and amused, like an uncle who tells you secrets over stew. His logs grow in size, passed around, first by the scribes for amusement, then by architects curious about the acoustic quality of palace renovations. One particularly drowsy vizier claims the bathhouse tone study cured his insomnia better than any recitation of legal codes. Outside, the palace, life for the Janissaries is shifting. The core has grown increasingly powerful. Once forbidden to marry or own land, Janissaries are now doing both, often openly. They've become a political force, with officers lobbying for greater influence over court decisions. Some fear this growing independence. Others see it as inevitable. Halil remains apart from all of it. His rank remains low. His duties remain strange. While others train for the next campaign against the Habsburgs, he's inspecting brass flutes gifted from Moldavia and gently arguing with apprentices about whether cedarwood breathes more sweetly than cypress. Yet somehow, Halil's influence grows in quieter ways. Visiting dignitaries are shown his collection as a matter of prestige. A Venetian merchant writes in a letter home that one of the Sultan's soldiers is in possession of more wind instruments than all the Doge's musicians combined. A French Jesuit, bemused, notes that the Ottomans trained soldiers in silence, as one might train monks in war. Perhaps the highest compliment comes from a young calligrapher, newly assigned to palace duty, who describes Halil as a man whose boots do not echo, even in marble halls. It is during this time that Halil becomes fascinated with unplayable flutes. Some are broken, cracked from age or accident. Others are ceremonial, meant for display rather than breath. One is carved from stone, with holes too small for human fingers. Another has no mouthpiece at all. Halil doesn't discard these. Instead, he creates a special shelf in his collection, the instruments of silence. Each is labelled not by its sound, but by its imagined purpose. The flute with sealed ends, perhaps played in a dream. The pipe with holes arranged in a spiral, for a snake charmer in an upside-down world. The double-barreled bone flute with a whistle at both ends, to speak to two winds at once. These aren't jokes, they are respectful guesses, testimonies to what might have been, in a world where breath shaped wood in ways we've forgotten. One day, Halil receives a visit from the imperial astrologer. It's an unexpected meeting. Music and astrology rarely intersect in official matters, but the astrologer has a request. Would Halil consider composing a set of tones to mark the hours of the night? The palace already has clocks, both mechanical and water-based, but many courtiers find the tick of gears too harsh in the small hours. What they want is a gentle cue for sleep and wakefulness, something less intrusive, something musical. Halil proposes a flute suite, played once per hour between midnight and dawn, 7 notes, each held for precisely 21 heartbeats, with rests between long enough to fall back asleep. And so, in the early months of 1594, the night flute watch begins. Each night, a designated palace musician plays Halil's sequence. From the balcony of the inner garden, it is barely audible beyond the walls. Even within the court, it is heard only by light sleepers and cats. But those who hear it say the notes feel like dreams arriving on time. Halil, of course, does not perform the suite himself. He listens, he times it, he adjusts it when the weather changes the airflow. He logs everything. And yet, even in this quietly remarkable period of life, questions remain. Why did Halil never pursue higher rank? Why did he never marry, even once the rule was relaxed? Why did he, near the end of his life, commission a small wooden flute with no holes and give it no name? Some say he believed it was the purest form of instrument, an object not for playing, but for holding breath. Others say he was simply preparing for silence. You are still in Istanbul, and still within the world Halil left behind, though he is gone now. Not in a tragic way. There was no battlefield, no scandal, no mysterious disappearance. He simply lived and then stopped living, in much the same way he collected his flutes, quietly, gently, without insistence. In 1611, a mild winter morning brought word that Halil of Prizren had passed away in his sleep, his hands folded around a cedar wood flute of his own making. He had carved it 2 years prior and played it only once, for a scribe who noted that it sounded like snow falling into soup. There was no funeral procession, no long line of mourners. But for the next week, the musicians of Topkapi Palace played the Night Watch suite twice each night. Once at the usual hour, and once just before dawn, when the last stars clung to the sky like punctuation marks. And yet, the question lingered. What would happen to his collection? Halil's flute room, modest though it was, had by then grown to contain over 200 instruments. Some were playable, others ornamental. A few were broken, purposefully or not. The Ottoman court, always half organized and half chaotic, wasn't sure who officially owned them. The Janissary Corps argued it was part of their archives. The musicians claimed artistic heritage. The scribes believed the logbooks had historical value and should be stored with documents. A distant cousin of Halil's appeared to claim the flutes as family property, though he had never played a note in his life and had, in fact, once referred to wind instruments as frivolous plumbing. The Grand Vizier was asked to intervene. He declined. Instead, he issued a temporary order. The collection would be moved to a small pavilion near the imperial kitchens, a space once used for drying herbs, and protected until a decision could be made. No one ever made it. So the pavilion stood, flutes neatly arranged, dusted weekly by a low-ranking archivist who sometimes played one when no one was looking. For a time, it became something of a court curiosity. Foreign guests were occasionally shown the Janissary musician's legacy, often with exaggerated stories. One guide claimed Halil had crafted a flute from elephant tusk that summoned birds. Another swore he'd invented a reed pipe tuned to the harmonic vibrations of the moon. The real story was quieter, and like many quiet things, it was largely forgotten. By 1640, the room had been repurposed to store scrolls on taxation. The flutes were packed into labelled boxes. The logbooks were moved to a different wing, misfiled under court musicality, speculative. A few of the instruments were redistributed, some to musicians, some lost in transit, and Halil's name faded from official record, but not entirely. In the early 1700s, a travelling Persian philosopher named Mirza Hafez-e-Kashani visited Istanbul and recorded in his diary a strange encounter at a bookseller's stall. He had purchased a worn notebook, its pages full of careful, Ottoman script and odd poetic notations beside what looked like diagrams of flutes. He asked the seller, Who wrote this? The man shrugged. A soldier, or a madman? Mirza was intrigued. He spent that spring translating the notebook into Persian. He noted Halil's peculiar habit of describing silences as personalities, and his belief that certain flutes carried the memory of places they'd never been. Then he added a line of his own. This is not madness. This is scholarship tuned one octave softer than the world prefers. The translated copy found its way east. In Isfahan, a music teacher used excerpts as meditative reading before lessons. In Delhi, a Sufi flutist cited Halil's phrasing in his own treatise on wind and breath. By 1800, parts of Halil's logbooks had been recopied into multiple languages, not widely, but with quiet respect. Meanwhile, in Istanbul, the flutes themselves resurfaced briefly. During the reign of Sultan Mahmud II, r. 1808-1839, efforts were made to modernize the empire, including reforms to military education and the arts. A young court librarian tasked with inventorying forgotten archives stumbled upon a dusty crate labeled "Sound Sticks, Miss C." Inside were 23 of Halil's flutes, along with 2 damp logbooks. Recognizing the handwriting from older, calligraphic samples, the librarian set about cataloguing the flutes again. This time, he added footnotes, comparisons to current musical theory, speculation on regional origins, and soft questions like, what precisely is meant by the silence of soup? He petitioned to open a museum of quiet instruments, proposing a small gallery near the outer court gardens. The petition was denied. Budget constraints, structural priorities, a vague unease at showcasing the eccentricity of a janissary during a time of military reform. There is nothing strategic, said one court official, about soup flutes. Still, the flutes were not destroyed. They were stored again, this time more carefully. A few made their way to the Imperial Conservatory. One was gifted to a visiting Austrian musicologist, who described it as beautifully pointless. Another was borrowed by a French Orientalist who tried to play it on stage in Paris, unsuccessfully but to polite applause. As for the rest, they're still somewhere, maybe in museum basements, maybe in family trunks mislabeled as antique kitchen, tools, maybe in the hands of children who will one day blow across a hole and wonder why it sounds like a secret waiting to be remembered. What makes a person's life important? For Halil, there were no great battles, no famous patrons, no published treatises. He didn't invent an instrument or revolutionize a style. What he did was listen, to silence, to architecture, to the breath that came before sound. He catalogued things no one thought worth noting. The stillness of dawn, the sigh of a cold room, the soft acoustics of a bored soldier whistling between drills. He taught others, sometimes indirectly, often accidentally, that the world is full of quiet stories, waiting to be heard if you only lean close enough. And isn't that what history is really? Not the loud parts, wars, decrees, coronations, but the soft ones. Someone carving a flute from cedar and wondering if wind can remember. Perhaps it can, and perhaps tonight it's remembering for you. If you had lived in 8th century Korea, you might have told time not by the sun, or the moon, or by tolling bells, but by the whisper of water slipping into bronze bowls. There would have been no ticking, no swinging pendulums, no sand running through glass bulbs. Just the quiet hush of a drop falling into a chamber, again and again, as predictable as breath. The ancient Koreans didn't need sound to know the hour. They used silence itself, divided, paced, and recorded in a way that made time feel more like a tide than a race. This is the story of the clepsydra, or water clock, as perfected by the engineers of the Silla and later Goryeo dynasties, and the people who stood beside them, watching the hours pool gently into place. Timekeeping. In Korea likely began as it did elsewhere, with nature. The rooster's cry, the rising mist, the length of a shadow. But with the growth of cities and centralized administration, Under the unified Silla dynasty, 668–935 CE, more precise systems were needed. Temples needed to know when to strike the drum for morning prayer. Government officials needed to coordinate records and rituals. Farmers needed to understand the shifts of seasons. Kings wanted to demonstrate control, not just of people and land, but of time itself. The water clock was the solution. The earliest clepsydras used in Korea were like